Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you ever so much for joining us for a very special Dare Dallas webinar this afternoon. As you can see, we're not in my loft or in my office or in David Dallas's house or office either. We're actually today, we're in the Haberdashers Hall, one of the great 12 livery companies here in London. And we're very, very pleased to be joined by Dr. David Bartle. So good afternoon, David.
Hello, good afternoon.
And today it's a rather special one because we're here to talk about the Hammersley Salt, one of the items here at Haberdashers Hall that I think has got all of us rather excited when we've been working here. And David has very kindly said that he would pop along and actually have a chat about this item. But first of all, David, I think for those of our viewers that don't really have an idea about the Haberdashers Hall and where we are, could you give us a brief 101 of where we are and why we're here?
I'll try. I mean, basically, hello everybody. I'm actually not in the hall, I'm at home, but that's because I'm working from home, you know, think pandemic and how it's altered everybody's routines, where they are and when they're where they are. But yes, the hall that it's coming from is the fourth hall of the company in West Smithfield. And we are a thing that's called a livery company. We're number 8 in the Great 12 list of livery companies. So we're quite an old livery company, it goes back to the 14th century. And we had, as you can tell from me telling you that it is the fourth hall that everyone's sitting in at the moment over there. We had 3 previous ones and we lost them in history. The most important thing to know is that the Hammersley Salt, as we'll be discussing, is one of our oldest pieces of silver. So it goes right back to having been in our very first hall, which we occupied in the 15th century and lasted until the Great Fire of 1666. After that, we built a second hall on the same site, and this was over near the Guildhall in Gresham Street. We built a second hall on the same site, which lasted until December 1940 in the Blitz, when sadly it was destroyed. And then in 1956, we built a third hall, much smaller, on the same site and let out the majority of the site to a tenancy for income reasons, which the whole lot of that, the whole buildings on that site became a problem in the sort of 1980s, early 90s, deterioration of materials, that kind of thing. So we needed to build a new hall and the tenant wanted a new office. In the end, we couldn't fit both on the same site and we were able to acquire the premises of the fourth hall that everyone's in now from St. Bartholomew's Hospital and moved in there in 2002. The previous hall site is now dedicated offices. So that's how there comes to be a fourth hall and everyone's sitting in it. And I don't know if you can see it, but in the middle of those 3 things on the table is this Hammersley Salt. What I thought might be quite helpful is if I tell you a little bit about the person who gave it, and perhaps also a little anecdote that I can add at the end about its rather tortuous history, because I do know a little bit more about that. The man who gave this is a gentleman called Sir Hugh Hammersley. And we know exactly what he looks like because a large portrait of him is in our livery hall. So he's quite a distinguished, quite a well-established figure as one of our earlier members. So he was born in 1565 and he died in 1636. And he became a member of the company, the Haberdashers Company, by something called patrimony. That's because his father had previously been a member. So he came in because his father had been a member. In 1588, when he was aged about 22 or 23, he was master, meaning head person of the company, in 1620, and then he did it again in 1628. He was master again then. And in that year, he was also Lord Mayor of the City of London. That's not unusual for that period. Quite often in other companies, not just ours, mastership of a company and being Lord Mayor could be run simultaneously. He was Colonel of the City of London's militia from 1619 to 1633. And after his term as mayor in 1628, he was knighted by King Charles I. That's when he became Sir Hugh Hammersley. During the 1620s, he was on the boards of several merchant companies because essentially what he was a major importer, exporter, merchant type of gentleman, including the companies of Russia, the Levant, East India, France, Virginia, and Spain. There is a large monument to Sir Hugh Hammersley in the church of St. Andrew's Undershaft in London, which is opposite the new Lloyd's building. And the monument consists of a life-size statue of Sir Hugh and his wife, Mary Durham was her name, and also includes his coat of arms. He had an interest in technology, rather surprisingly, for the period. In 1625, he procured London's first fire engines, or what were called water spouts at the time. But he was also interested in history, and he insisted that the city buy a copy of Holinshed's Chronicles because of what those chronicles had to say about the circumstances in which the city's charters had been granted to various companies and organizations. So I think it's quite interesting that he was bringing in these water spouts not long after they were needed, of course, for the Great Fire that burnt down the hall. So they weren't really up to the job, I do have to say. So the Hammersley Salt, which we're going to be thinking about, is decorated, as far as I'm aware, and I don't know, the colleagues over in the hall might vary from this, with scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. That's what is thought to be in the relief work on it. And I think that's one of its finest features. It dates from 1595, but was gifted to the company by Sir Hugh Hammersley in his will of 1636. So that's how it came into the possession of the company.
So it was actually owned by him as a personal piece beforehand?
Yes, it would have been something which he would have owned personally, and which he decided to dispense to the company as he was distributing goods to various people, so in his will. So it would have been his own. He would have owned it. It may have even belonged to his father. I don't know how he acquired it or when he acquired it entirely. But I was going to say a little bit of an anecdote that is pertinent to all this. One thing about our silver and one thing about many livery company silver is they're short on older silver of this sort of period of the sort of 16th century or thereabouts. And that's because over history, monarchs have had a rather cruel tendency to treat livery companies as cash cows, to decide to take the silver of beautiful objects like this sort of salt, melt them down and pay their soldiers. And here is an example of this during the Civil War. There is in our archives a letter of 1648 from Thomas Lord Fairfax, one of the generals of Oliver Cromwell, who wrote to the Lord Mayor of London under the title, "For the better understanding and preserving a right understanding between the city and the army." It includes an order to someone called Colonel Dean, one of the parliamentary colonels, to march into the city and seize the public treasures of the goldsmiths, weavers, and haberdashers. Now, in this hall, there would have been that salt. I have also recorded in the minutes, the master and wardens of the company were tipped off about this silver raid and hid as much valuable silver as possible before the Hammersley, the Hammersley Salt, before the arrival of Colonel Dean. I mean, you know, you can imagine, I can imagine anyway, they got this word, it was probably word of mouth, look how he's coming, you know, they're coming. And so they bloody well ran around the building, they picked up everything they could think of that was valuable, like Hammersley Salt. They ran out the back, they probably buried it under the earth, I don't know what they did, but they just hid it. And then, of course, they would have lost things because they couldn't have done that to everything. So they would have come and taken some of the valuables to melt down. But there's a very graphic example of what I mean when I say that we were cash cows.
So
I think it's incredibly interesting. As the person who's been looking at the silver, I felt incredibly privileged actually to come and be seeing the Hammersley Salt, because I have known about the Hammersley Salt. It's written about in a definitive book by Sir Charles Jackson. So I've already knew of its existence and felt quite lucky to be seeing it. But after having heard what David's had to say, the fact that it survived the Fire of London, it survived raiding for soldiers' wages, and it survived the Blitz, but I think we're rather fortunate to be seeing it at all.
Quite so.
And what you say is incredibly pertinent in terms of what you've said about it being in the ownership of a wealthy merchant, because salts at this time, salt was an extremely rare commodity, as we will know. And so owning a salt cellar or a standing salt, as we call these, was a mark of real prestige, because it meant you had salt. And salt, well, Alastair has written an article which you'll find on the website about this, but salt was a very costly commodity. So it was you needed something of equal value and stature to display it. And I mean, this is the most extraordinary piece. And I don't know if we can show people that are looking, but this relief that you talked about, the Ovid's Metamorphosis, it's done in extraordinary relief. And I think sometimes today we forget, because we have machines and lasers and heaven knows what else. This was all done by hand from a piece of silver. And the relief, it's probably about half a centimetre proud. And the sort of the definition of musculature and of foliage and expressions on people's faces, it's absolutely phenomenal when you consider what tools people had at their disposal to make this.
I mean, just again, talking about the time that this thing was actually constructed and was made, and you look at the rest of the world at this point in time and what people were creating, and people were, still, on carts and taking vegetables to market every day. And you've got this, which is just the complete antithesis of something which is just so advanced for its years. And again, the story about the potential kind of a mob of roundheads coming to steal the silver, I think is phenomenal. And the fact that this piece, the thing that sat right in front of us, would have been hidden away during the Civil War. I mean, it's phenomenal, isn't it, really? I mean, that whole kind of, it is absolutely remarkable. David, when you think about the salt, and I mean, is it still used? Do you still use it for dinners?
Not with salt in.
No.
And not either for its other social status purpose, because I know you're both aware, but people probably, I don't know, most people may be aware, there's a phrase saying sitting above and below the salt. Because salts like this were used to indicate who were the important people who sat, as it were, at the top end of the table, and then below the salt, they sort of were going down the table away from it. So your status was in almost in relation to it. And that's part of the reason it was such an eye-catching standout piece. It was like a marker as much as a salt container. But no, it's not used for salt anymore. It's used to put in front of the master quite often at an important livery dinner or something like that. So in that sense, it's retained some of its social meaning, if you like, though it's not really thought of. It does sort of, in a traditional sense, do that. But it's decorative now rather than functional.
But it is, without doubt. And as I say, Jenny and I have been working on this for quite a while now. And it is probably one of the most important salt cellars in the world, without any shadow of doubt. Yeah, and it's a fantastic thing to see. In terms of, recent things that have sold in the past few years, there really is nothing that is on a level with it at all. Jenny, were you going to ask some questions about it?
Well, I was going to point out something which I could ask David, but I say, we're talking about a silver salt, and for those of you watching in Technicolor, as we do, you'll see that it looks as if it's gold, but it isn't. David, you will probably explain. It's silver gilt, and the gilding. Interesting to hear you say it's not used anymore, but the gilding, for those of you who are chemists amongst our viewers, will know that salt actually corrodes silver. So part of the reason that any bowl of any silver salt, even today, needs to be gold rather than silver, or indeed have a liner of some sort, is that without the gilding, the salt would corrode into the silver. And David will probably know, because you be very familiar with this. There is some slight pit. I mean, it's an extraordinary condition, but there is some slight pitting in the bowl, which was obviously
the salt.
The salt, yeah.
No, it's a remarkable piece. And for those of you that haven't read my article, please do read it. It's available on our website. And obviously, if you connect with us on LinkedIn, we'll more than happily send you out all of our articles. But it does talk about the fact that salt at this point in time was such a fantastically important commodity. I think for those of you that do speak Latin, salary obviously descends from the term for salt, and the amount of money that you receive was compared to salt at the time. So a very, very important thing. Now, we have got two other items here as well.
Well, this I would like to ask David about, because we've pulled these to talk about. We're obviously mainly talking about the Hammersley salt, but whilst we've been looking at the silver, we've come across these, which are the Osborne salts, and I wonder, David, if you knew anything about how they came into the collection, because they are by a very well-known maker. I'm sure you'll enlighten us. But
Omar Ramsden.
Omar Ramsden, indeed. But they're Elizabethan replicas, but with a slight twist of his own. So I wondered if you could tell us how they came to join the Hammersley Salt.
Well, I mean, I think, well, they're gifts of Osborne. So, I mean, I'm a member whose surname is that. So that's why they're called the Osborne salts. I think they are, to some extent, indicative of the importance of the Hammersley salt, because I think they were really given to echo the Hammersley salt. I think that it's a part illustration of how much the company has regarded the Hammersley salt through time, not just hiding it in the Civil War from being melted down, but also having a later master of the company wanting to commemorate the form of the Hammersley salt into supporting similar salts, in order to make it possible for a dinner, a function, to have the three of them set out in a formal way along the table to look more spectacular.
And that makes absolute sense, and it makes me think that one of the things that the livery companies in particular do so well, and perhaps especially at the Haberdashers, is that they are great commissioners of pieces. So then the livery companies don't, although they thrive on tradition, they don't stand still, do they? So as I've looked at your silver, I've seen that over the years, over the centuries, pieces have been commissioned. And Omar Ramsden, who, in fact, this is Ramsden and Carr, so with his partner Alwyn Carr, but very, very well-known makers in their own right. And you, as the livery companies, have commissioned in almost every decade the best makers of the time to make pieces for the hall, and that's an absolute pleasure to see. And it sort of reinforces your idea that as people have bequeathed or given pieces to the hall, there's a flow to it, and it hasn't, it's still currently, there are still pieces coming into the hall, aren't there?
There are still currently pieces, not at the rate they were. I mean, I think the truth is a little bit in what I said at the beginning about, or earlier about, the raiding on the silver. I mean, this didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. It happened a lot. And it didn't just happen to us. It happened to all the livery companies in the city. And so, you'd be suddenly denuded in silver. And what's hard to remember is that it wasn't just, as we might use it now, more decorative. It was practically needed, a lot of the silver. It was for use, for eating and drinking and doing what the company did. So there was an urgent need to replace. And that generated a lot of spending by the company on the silversmiths and goldsmiths of the day to help do that. And of course, masters would chip in personally to give gifts during their time as master to help that effort. And I think that went on for quite a long time. You'd have some dips in the silver's been taken yet again, let's replenish it, and go for a commission of new pieces. And it's led to the idea that there's an artistry in silver. And so I don't think it's just this company. People don't just who love silver and who are interested in silver, don't just see it as a metal, as a value. They see it as a material to work an artwork in. And I think that's what's going on now. A lot of the more modern pieces interpreted in a 20th or 21st century context of what is an artistic, pleasing and detailed, iteration of an artwork in that metal.
That's such a pertinent thing to say, because just before we went live, Alastair and I were talking about the relief work around the salt here, and just saying it is as detailed as an old master painting, and the sort of the attention to pose and accuracy and how hair falls. So you're absolutely right to say that, because this is an absolute work of art, and it might almost, I don't know if I'm going to try and show people the musculature on there. Can you see on the figure, or we'll turn it round here? It's just absolutely extraordinary, and it is, to me, a complete work of art. I mean, however sort of focused you get on any part of this salt, it's absolutely perfect. It's absolutely extraordinarily intricate. There's the detailing is phenomenal. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to sort of handle it and see it in the flesh.
Was Hammersley a connoisseur of silver? Were there any records that he collected any other pieces, or do we know anything more about him, or was he just a general collector?
No idea, but I mean, wealthy merchants in the city of London and in other cities around the country would have had plate and silver just as part of their household goods. In fact, many churches are the same, and you'll find quite a lot of interesting pieces of silver in church collections, used originally in their, or sometimes continuingly in their services. I don't have any knowledge that Hammersley was a particular collector of silver. I'd have no doubt, but it's a guess that his house would have had a lot of silver in it. And perhaps pieces on the same level as the Hammersley Salt that went goodness knows where.
I mean, it would be possible that his children or descendants might have been annoyed at one point that I was actually not left to them, because it is I mean, even in its day, this would have been a ridiculously tremendous piece. I mean, a magnificent piece in its day, and even more so now, certainly.
I mean, clearly, the fact that he gave it to the company is an indication of how he loved the company.
And what would his role have been within the company, and what would his kind of day-to-day kind of things with the company? Was it just a case of being a member? Did he play a particular?
No. Well, I mentioned in what I said he was twice its master.
No.
Now, in 1620, that's when he first was its master. Quite an important year, if you think about it, because it was the sailing of the Mayflower and all sorts of things like that, and the discoveries in America beginning. Being master of a livery company is, at that period, a very important role. You were close to the Lord Mayor. You probably personally know the monarch. In fact, Charles I knighted him, and he probably knew him personally. Right. He would have decided the policy of the company. He would have worked with what are called wardens in the company, but he would have been the most important person in the company in 1620 and in 1628, not just any member. He, of course, was a member. He was the top member, and he would have moved in circles of great, both political and mercantile influence.
How many members would the Haberdashers have had at that point, would you think?
It's gone up and down over history. It's difficult to say, and the balance of what the membership is like has varied. At the time of Sir Hugh Hammersley, most members coming in would have been known as apprentices. Some were starting, and he's a case in point, of coming in because their father had been in through a process called patrimony, but that was still a developing side of life. I don't know precisely how many members were in at that time. It would have been in the hundreds. I mean, today we have 900 members. I suspect that that's slightly higher than probably would have been the case at the time. So, yeah, it would have been a company more related to its trade. Today, I'm afraid our trade of haberdashery is long, long gone, along with the other cloth-related companies.
So the prerequisites for membership are somewhat different in Hammersley's day than they are now.
Yes, I mean, not necessarily more, but the emphasis has changed as to what it's about. I mean, obviously, members at the time would have come in as they've been apprentices. They would have been working their lives in the cloth trade in the city of London. They would have been freemen. They would have been part of the economic life of the city. And of course, these days, without the trade, I don't know how many people know about the schools that the company has involvement with, but perhaps we will have heard of things like the Haberdashers School and things like that. There are educational responsibilities. Many livery companies, because of certain benefactors, not Sir Hugh Hammersley in this case, but other benefactors, have in their wills given responsibilities to start up educational and what are called almshouses and things like that. So today, the company's activities are mainly in an educational context. And so members coming to the company don't have a trade to learn, even if they're apprentices. They're learning more about the charitable and educational work of the company in its current activities.
We've got a question come in from the floor. Excuse me whilst I just have a look up here. So, This is relating to a slightly different subject, but I'm not sure whether this would be in the 1951 Goldsmith Hall exhibition catalogue. It states that the cover is lacking. Any idea what form that would have taken? I don't think that's going to be a question for you, really, is it?
No, I'm afraid I do. I am aware that
I'll have a lot of salts like this, which are known as standing salts, did have covers, and they tended to be domed, quite intricate covers with probably a cast finial on the top. So I can't speak about the whereabouts of the cover of this salt, but it is not unlikely that originally it did have it almost would look like a turreted. It was a turreted domed cover. So it's a good question. It probably, in all likelihood, especially given that you referenced the Goldsmiths catalogue, it's highly likely at some point that it did have a cover. I mean, I'm quite astounded it survived the life it had. So
I was going to say, it probably got buried at some point over the centuries and didn't get recovered. One could possibly ask it.
Well, covers, I mean, are detachable, which is a vulnerability in historical survival. So I have no doubt it had a cover at some point, but it's never been shown, or no indication of cover is any record in any record I've seen, albeit it probably did have one at some point.
I think it probably did, and the point of the cover was twofold, really. One is, we've discussed that salt was a very valuable commodity, but it's also salt absorbs moisture. So when you covered it, it kept it safe and it kept it dry, or ostensibly kept it safe.
Fantastic. Right, I'm just going to open up to the floor and see if we have any more questions. We've got another one coming in here. Let's have a quick look. Okay, we've covered that. Right, okay, well, we haven't got any more questions from the floor, so I'm going to take this opportunity to say thank you ever so much to Dr. David Bartle for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and your knowledge and enthusiasm for the hall is obviously shining through, not just with the silver, but with every item in here. There's some. It's a lovely place to be with some fantastic pieces around, and if you do ever get an opportunity to see them, please do. So David, thank you ever so much for joining.
Thank you.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for joining us today. Oh, I think we've actually just got another question at the bottom here. Oh, and just to thank you, and from Stephen saying thank you, and he thoroughly enjoyed the presentation. So thank you for joining us, Stephen.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, all I need to say is thank you very much for joining us. We will see you fairly soon. The actual Daredevil webinar is going to take a little bit of a break over the summer. We will be back in September, but for July and August, we'll be doing something a little bit new that you're going to be seeing over the next few weeks. So please do stay tuned. Please do follow us on LinkedIn, and obviously receive some interesting bits and bobs from us in your email box. So thank you again, David, and
thank you very much, David.
All right, bye-bye.